just to let everyone clear out.
Okay, so we have one person who signed up, Ms. Shackelford.
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
Good evening.
I just wanted, I understand that you guys will take a look at the report that, as I understand it, analyzes why there was a real shortfall with the senior tax relief. Tonight, I have no idea what that report says, but I just wanted to provide some input as a senior. My husband and I have lived in Decatur for 27 years. We've never had kids in the school system. We're both over 65. He's a lot more over 65 than I am. But we have paid what we feel like are fairly high taxes in Decatur all that length of time. The tax relief was such an incredibly welcome thing for us. I'm really apprehensive about how it's going to be replaced. You know, everybody should contribute to having good schools, but depending on how that gets replaced, we may not be able to afford aging in place in our home. And I have friends who have moved away because they can't afford to pay Decatur taxes. And also some people who never had kids or kids in the system. And I'm really, really puzzled as to why all this new development that's been going up all around us doesn't provide enough funding to have adequate funding for the school system. But just wanted to let you guys know that there are those of us who are real people who may have big life decisions to make depending on the outcome of how all this gets determined. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, David.
Hello.
We're at the superintendent's comment. Do you need a minute?
No, I have no comment.
All right, well, I have a few. I have a few. Well, first, we don't ordinarily address or respond to comments, Ms. Shackelford, but I will just let you know that the study that we've just received is on the agenda, but because we've just received it, we haven't generally actually read it yet. And so there's not going to be a very robust discussion. I'm not sure what that discussion is going to look like tonight. But it's not going to be very satisfying in terms of getting a sense of direction because we haven't read what's in the report yet. Other than that, I can just let you know that we're, you know, this exemption is something that's important to us. It was our initiative to pass it specifically because we think it's important to let seniors age in place. It did turn out to be much more expensive and have a much bigger impact on the budget than had been anticipated, which is the reason that we need to, well, it's mandated by law. It's got to be renewed. It sunsets after 5 years, so something has to happen. And in the process of asking the legislator to renew an exemption, we have to decide exactly what that should look like. And that's something that we're going to be studying with the aid of this Georgia State University report over the next several months and really next year. And so that's a process that we're going to have. And I can just say, please stay tuned and be part of it.
If you have any trouble accessing the report online, just call our district office or stop by and we can figure out how to get you a copy, okay?
And a few comments. First is a congratulations. The Georgia Department of Education has released our 2019 graduation rate. City Schools of Decatur graduation rate this is 95%, which is outstanding. It's a tribute to
Just
your
to
good
that
work.
point as well, just so folks know, whenever we have anything other than 100%, one of the things we do is look at every single kid who didn't graduate to look at why didn't they graduate, what's the situation, is there anything we could have done differently, et cetera. And I think that's one of the reasons we have such a high graduation rate, is we try to make sure that that does not happen.
Excellent. Next, our fiber optic network, we voted a while back to participate in the city and City Schools of Decatur fiber optic network. Construction of that network began in August, and over the fall break, we hit a significant milestone with the installation of new cable and fiber cable pathways into several schools. 6,000 feet of fiber cable have been run in the city in the first 28 days of this project. So this is a great example of cooperation between our school system and our city, which is one of the things that makes this such a great place to live. Next, our school resource officer, D'Amico, was honored by the Decatur High School JROTC, who hosted their annual 9/11 Remembrance Ceremony, where Officer Matthew D'Amico was honored with the 2019 9/11 Remembrance Award. So congratulations to Officer D'Amico, and thank you for all that you and our police do for our schools. Finally, we had a number of really great trips over fall break. So we need to welcome back the students who took trips to France, Ecuador, and Mexico. These are really I'm very proud that we're able to give our students these opportunities. And I think it's one of the things that makes this a special place, that we do have staff that take the initiative to make these kinds of trips happen, and staff and parents. It's a lot of work for everybody involved, both the planning and the going and chaperoning. So thanks to all who make those opportunities happen. And that's all I have for board chair comments, if anybody else has anything. Okay, that brings us to consent items. We have the personnel report, the school nutrition report, the financial reports, the development report, and CSD RFP, that's for the Decatur HS Career Tech Center. Do we have a motion to approve the consent items?
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
So that the consent items pass unanimously. And that brings us to our only informational report this week, which is the Equity Spotlight.
All right, who is kicking off our equity spotlight? All right, come on up, Craig.
Thank you. My incorrigible junior, Sean, was at the Ecuador trip, and it was a life-changing experience for the better. My name is Greg Wiseman, principal of Renfro. This is Laura Gary. She is a teacher of gifted at Renfro. We are 2/12 of the Renfro equity team. That simplifies to 1/6. And I didn't say reduced, I said simplified. So the other, 10/12 of the team either had guitar practices or soccer practices and other commitments, so we're representing the team. The Renfro Middle School Equity Spotlight is going to focus on our team's first equity-focused staff meeting that occurred yesterday and how it fits into the school's equity professional learning plan for the school year. So our team is Connections teachers Charlie McAdoo, Alicia McGill, Wesley Madhere, and Ashley McCullough. 7th grade assistant principal Sarah Talton-Buck, 8th grade assistant principal Alexis Glenn, 6th grade teachers Johnny Stroy, Vanessa Reed, 6th grade counselor Reagan Hudson, gifted teachers Robin Tibbetts and Laura Gary, myself, and Julie Vasquez as a parent. Thank you for this opportunity. And I think I have a... Okay. So, yesterday's staff meeting at Renfro was led by the equity team that focused on an important equity topic, restorative practices. Each month, our team will lead an entire staff meeting focused on various equity topics. The objective of yesterday's professional learning was to orient teachers to restorative circles and how to lead and participate in them. Restorative practices are processes that proactively build healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address conflict and wrongdoing. Restorative practices are increasingly being applied to individual schools and school districts to address youth behavior and improve school climate and culture. Restorative practices can improve relationships between students as well as educators whose behavior often serves as role models for students. They allow each member of the school community to help and implement the school's adopted core values. So restorative circles are an important restorative practice. Restorative circles support equity by giving everyone a voice where everyone is included while establishing relationship and community. This is how restorative circles support equity.
So before we met yesterday, the equity team sent out an email to all of the staff to reacquaint the staff with the Courageous Conversations Compass, and also to give them a little bit of information about restorative practices and why they are important. We used the article "Restorative Practices: Fostering Healthy Relationships and Promoting Positive Discipline in Schools" we put together a little kind of a two-pager about restorative practices. So as faculty entered the staff meeting yesterday, we had this slide up for them. They came into the library after dismissal, and they were directed to get a card from somebody with a number on it. And then on the back of the card, they were asked to write down a specific concern they are having with students. It could be a hallway, cafeteria, bus loop, in their classroom that they would like to address, and they were to write that on the back of their card. And then before we broke up into groups, the numbers on the cards were directing people. We're going to direct people to different groups. Before we broke up into groups, Reagan Hudson and Dr. Charlie McAdoo also introduced the norms that were the 4 agreements from the Courageous Conversations. And those are: stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-disclosure. And then each of the equity team members took a group of about 9 or 10 people into different classrooms, and we engaged in a circle. Oh, sorry, forgot about that part. We also reminded everybody that the Courageous Conversations Compass is a tool that we want to keep using. It's a personal navigational tool to guide participants through conversations. It helps us know where we are personally, as well as to recognize the direction from which other participants come. So we broke into breakout sessions. Teachers moved to the 9 classrooms to participate in a restorative circle that was modeled by an equity team member. Not every equity team member was comfortable leading a circle yet, and so we made this transparent and modeled that all of us can jump into these circles before becoming an expert. If the circles don't go perfectly, which they didn't all go perfectly, but they were great. It was okay. And so we went into as an equity team, we went into this activity with the mindset that we are not experts and we are growing together. And then here are some of our circles in action. Yeah, it was good.
So once we broke up into our breakout sessions, they were organized in these steps. First of all, we talked about the shape of the circle. A circle is a strong message where everyone can be seen and heard. And the second one explained why we meet in circles in which to build community, solve classroom concerns, and to restore conflicts. Thirdly, then we reviewed the 4 circle guidelines, which are: speak from the heart, listen from the heart, be spontaneous, and just say enough. Number 4 is we then would conduct a check-in round. It's kind of a warm-up with a low-risk prompt that will encourage full participation. For example, in the group I led, the prompt was, what country would you like to visit? Just to get the juices flowing and the mechanics of how the circle will work. Then we jumped into the core activity. Choosing from each of the groups had a fishbowl with the cards in it, and we chose one of the cards that the teachers wrote on, and then that they completed earlier, and used that issue that the teachers identified to model a circle. For example, the one I chose in my group was students using the word bullying loosely. So that was like our prompt, that was our issue that we then modeled the circle around. So the things that the three steps of that circle is, like, the first question you ask is, how does this problem affect, and in this situation, you, teachers? So we went around, we have a talking piece. So when you have the talking piece, you're to speak from the heart. If you don't have the talking piece, you're listening from the heart. So we went around and shared. You could do that, like, going around the circle. We decided to kind of hand it to when somebody wanted to speak and popcorn it that way. And then we do that, and then the next prompt is, okay, so how does this problem affect your students? We did the same. And then lastly, what are your ideas about working on the problem? And we did that. Some of the groups were able to pick 2 or 3 cards. Some of the groups really got involved in the one they picked. In my group, we only did the one card. And then there was a closing round of basically a debrief, how the process felt in one short phrase, just debriefing the process of it. Okay, then after the debrief, each group ended with a compass check-in. We got the compass back out to kind of to orient us and how we felt, how things went. All teachers received a pocket guide for restorative questions. It's basically question prompts to actually pull out and use when you're dealing with, like, a small group of kids in a maybe a conflict situation. Then today, we emailed teachers a note of thanks and a link to some of the following resources. Basically, we showed them the lesson plan from the training, a link to restorative practices and Circles Handbook, a brief restorative practice guide for teachers that outlines a handful of restorative practices, including circles, a link to an awesome Circles toolkit that provides specific examples of circles that can be replicated in classrooms, and also a copy of the Courageous Conversations Compass. The staff were also sent a Google form for them to produce so they could provide feedback on the professional learning experience so we can make it better next time. So that was yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Monday after a break. So that was the first of 8 equity professional learning opportunities for the Renfro staff to be scheduled throughout the school year. But right now I'd like to talk about, like, what's coming, what's moving forward, what are we doing next? So we're gonna have monthly equity topics. Each CSD school is going to cover the following topics this year: restorative practices, whiteness, diversifying the curriculum, culturally relevant teaching, race-based trauma, systemic racism, standardized testing and racism, cultures within cultures, and internalized racism. Each school equity team chose one of those topics to do the research on, gathered the resources, and we all upload them into a shared Google folder for all the schools to share. So, my equity team doesn't have to do the research on all 8 of those topics. Claremont chose one of the topics, and we'll go from them and use the resources they have. But using these school equity planning charts, and the shared resources, each school can plan their professional learning for the month the way it really suits the school. So we have some flexibility there. We've also received a lot of support from our equity coordinator, Dr. Banks, in many different ways. She's attending our equity team meetings at the schools. She is the resource for all things equity. She's provided us a framework for us to really dive into this important work, and she's really taken charge of, like, our professional learning in this work. The Beyond Diversity 1 training that, like, almost all the staff has had, except for maybe the new hires. In my staff, we've had the Intro to Restorative Practices using Circles effectively for all admin, counselors, and instructional coaches. And then the next training for that is facilitating restorative conferences. That's days 3 and 4 that my assistant principals attended, and hopefully my counselors will be attending another one that's coming up soon. So that's that. Thanks for this opportunity. And do you have any questions?
I do.
do.
I will first say that I am quite impressed with the topics that you will be delving into over the next few months. Those are not easy topics at all, and they're not superficial by any means. And so for anyone that may think that these equity circles and equity teams were put together for the schools as just a show, or just to show that we're maybe doing a little something about equity, need to see what topics you guys are getting ready to talk about. Very, very deep. So I really do appreciate that. And so this question can be for either one of you, but what was your biggest takeaway from the circle, And what would you like to see happen maybe at the next one that you may not have seen at this one?
The next one, the next circle, or
The next circle, I
Okay.
guess, yeah.
Well, in the group I led, it was great. I guess I had like 9 or 10 teachers in it, and they were very enthusiastic. Some of them have already jumped in and started circles, and I think it really hit home that it's like, I'm not an expert at this, but like you don't learn until you do it. I kind of stress that like you're not going to break anything, just jump in and do it. And, we've heard some stories of where kids are now saying, oh, sorry, Miss So-and-so, we haven't started our circle yet. We need to back up. So it's catching on. So it's good. Like we talked a lot about how it's great for beginning of the school. It's great for, after a break to kind of reacquaint. It's good to have circles just to connect as humans, not just to always like solve a problem. It's like, oh, we've got to gather up and circle again because of how we came back from lunch, or we got to gather up and circle again because of like how like this happened in the classroom. It doesn't always need to be a negative thing. It could be, I think it's a great thing for like connections teachers when they have a new group of students every 12 weeks to start off and like build that culture in your class and to invest that time in the beginning. Teachers are very nervous about spending that time on non-academic things, but to me, it's an investment in like a smooth sailing classroom.
I'd like to add my impression of the circles yesterday, the group that I led, people really wanted to talk. People really, we have a lot of staff meetings where it's just, we've touched on this issue before in full group meetings, and it's just hard for people to express themselves, to express their concerns or frustrations in a big group. There's not enough time. The setting isn't right. So in my group, people really wanted to share. So I was heartened by that, and what I would like to see going forward is more of that willingness to kind of share our feelings, our concerns, our hopes, our ideas. I think this was sort of the first time people were just like, this is what's going on. And so it was really, it didn't follow the protocol maybe as closely as it could. And so I think there could be more productive meetings going forward. But I would like to see us keep that open dialogue with each other. I think as staff, we don't have enough opportunities to do that. And I think that was important. And if we could do that more, I think it would help us grow as a staff, and it would help us do more significant work in this area.
In a structured way, like it's not
Yeah.
just a complaining session.
Right.
And the one thing I shared with my group was like, sometimes I'm a fan of protocols in certain situations, and sometimes I'm just like, can we just talk, And I think the circles is a real good in-between of, there's just enough structure, so when you're speaking, you're heard, and when you're not speaking, you're listening, and that's it. So.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I'm interested to hear, to what extent are these circles being implemented in the classroom environment, and what does that look like so far?
So different teachers are jumping into it. Some are still a little hesitant. I think our 8th grade team is one that is really jumping in both feet and are doing them on like really regular basis. But like, this was kind of like our first kickoff, like just, take the shackles off and just do it. It's not rocket science, and it's not like, again, you're not gonna break something if you don't do it right, but we provide a lot of good resources, and it is the expectation that like, this is something that's happening at Renfro Middle School.
I'll give you an example. I did one a few weeks ago. Students had finished a project, and at the end of the project, they were getting kind of stressed out, and I was hearing talk here and there. And so after the project was finished, I brought them together in a circle, and I just asked them some questions about how they felt and let them share some concerns and say what they liked about the project, what was hard for them about the project. And so I didn't have like a protocol of these are the specific questions. It was more of a, here's a time for us to get together as a class and share some thoughts that they had. So, and kids seem open to the idea of having an opportunity to share.
And my admin team and I have done small circles with kids with, that have like, certain like discipline issue to happen, and having some like kind of restitution and things like that. So we've been doing that since last year.
Okay, thank you.
I really appreciate that you, in the kind of the order of the protocol, it ended with coming up with some solutions. And, I'm curious to hear, were there any notable good solutions that came out of any of the discussion groups that, and then I guess the other thing is balancing with, I'm glad to see you using the compass from Beyond, Courageous Conversations, in the sense that you have to kind of create a safe space where people can be comfortable being uncomfortable with the non-closure stuff. So maybe you don't get to solutions, maybe you get to the next step. And probably one of my biggest concerns was, how do we as a board support that very difficult, safe, uncomfortable, solution-focused environment?
Well, in my circle, your original question was like the solution was, we do first couple weeks of school really hitting home like these dream lessons and like some things in the code of conduct, and we touch on bullying, but like I think what we came up with is, I said, as an administrator, I have these conversations with parents all the time, email, call, my son's been bullied, blah, 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 and I'm like, okay, so, do you have a copy of the student code of conduct? Open it up. Let's take a look at it. Let's read what like the definition of bullying is. And so we kind of talked about that as this, with kids, is really getting down to what it says bullying is. And is it bullying, or is this kid just not being nice to you? And so kind of figuring out what the difference is between bullying. Because like as educators, bullying is we get very specific about what it is, and what it's not.
In my group, we talked about some takeaways. We had a little bit of a harder question.
Yeah, you guys did.
So the one I pulled out of the hat was students calling me racist in the hallway that I don't teach, and so that was a heavier topic to dive into. And our takeaways were that we build relationships with the students. That one of the best ways that we can keep our students from having those feelings is to build relationships with them. We talked about how we teach all of the students at Renfro. We don't just teach the students in our class, that we feel like they all are ours, and we want to foster relationships with all of them. And consistency is one way to do that. We also talked about when things like that happen, when you're kind of challenged like that from a student, to both take it from, consider the source. We're dealing with adolescents that have interesting perspectives, but to also be introspective about what they're saying. And a lot of the people in my group thought, okay, well, when somebody says something like that to me, they examine what they're doing. They all said they stopped and kind of thought, okay, well, could I have maybe handled that differently with that student than I might have handled it differently with another student. So I felt like people were saying that self-reflection was an important part of making improvements. So I think those were the two action items that we talked about.
So have you gotten the sense that of the teachers who are doing their own circles, like your 8th grade team, that they're embracing it?
Definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
good. And the students?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, students are asking for it.
Excellent.
Was there, coming out of it, I mean, you're gonna do 7 more of these. What did you figure out needs to be done differently going forward?
So the reflection form to the teachers just went out, so we
Yeah.
haven't gotten that feedback yet.
Okay.
But as Ms. White said, now starting off with restorative practices was kind of like the softball one. Like we didn't jump into systemic racism. That's going to be an interesting. Whiteness is going to be like an interesting one.
Yeah.
But what we have the flexibility with, like, so we might, like, if we felt like one of these topics was something that like our staff is already so on top of, like we might not have a staff meeting on it. Our focus might be more like a parent night for parents, or it might be a student focused one. So it's not always it doesn't always have to be like a staff meeting with staff members. It might be something smaller with staff depending on the topic, and more focused on parents or more focused on students. So we have that flexibility.
It's terrific. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks,
very
y'all.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I think I've shared this before, but we have started opening all of our cabinet meetings and admin council and things like that with circles. And while so far we haven't had to do them for restorative purposes, but we have focused on things that are it's just nice. Like, what's something you're excited about? Or what's something that's worrying you right now? Or what's something that you did fun in the last 2 weeks or something like that. And it's just a really nice opportunity to get to know people in a way you didn't normally, and it just sets a nice tone for a meeting when you start off that way. Like a cabinet, for instance, we always do it standing up because it just feels different. You know, you don't have the barriers the way you would otherwise, and it's neat. It's a neat process.
I think it is neat. And I was thinking that for these meetings, we should maybe begin with a round of thorns and roses. Garrett? Maybe next time. We'll give you a chance to think about it.
All right.
Just kidding. Let's see. I forgot that Mark has a hard stop at what, 8:45?
8:45, yeah.
So we should be mindful of the clock.
No
I think
problem.
we got it.
Easy.
I think
I think we're in good shape, but thanks.
All right, this brings us to our action items. We've got, first, the board policy manual.
So the only changes on the policy manual, one, we realized, I can't remember when we realized it, but at some point, the board had asked me to write the administrative regulations about school governance, but we didn't actually have a hook for that in the board policy. So we now have that 2.1G. And then at the last discussion, we noticed the list of protected groups wasn't consistent. And so I think maybe Heather suggested, why don't we just refer to one list every time? So the only other place that the list of groups was delineated was in 2.62. And so that now references back to the same list. And so anytime we want to use that list, we'll just reference back to that. And those are reflected in this version 1.3.5.
Excellent. Have a motion?
So moved?
Second.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. All right. Oh, our first substantive action item is board member compensation.
Okay, so we've talked over several meetings. I listed all the different details in the board item about when we've had discussions and whatnot, but the gist of it is that the board compensation in the past was set by the city charter, City of Decatur charter, at $50 per month, and so the board policy reflected that. The city updated their charter a little over a year ago, if I remember correctly, to eliminate the language that set the dollar amount and instead give the board the discretion to set their own compensation, much like the policy is written for how the commissioners can set their own compensation. So after a bunch of different meetings where we've discussed this, the board decided that an appropriate stipend amount would be $600 per month. That would cover all the different activities associated with the performance of board duties and would allow for things like instead of having to do reimbursement for specific things like childcare, that's enough money that it should be able to cover some expenses that you have like that. So I have the recommended wording for changing of the policy there. For now, it needs to say, what do I need to say? Oh, for now, we need to have two different statements because this policy cannot take effect until after January of 2020, because a sitting board cannot change their compensation. It has to apply to the next board, which will technically be in place in January 2020. Therefore, for now, we'll need both sets of language. We'll need the set of language that would reflect the $600 per month in the future, and then the set of language that is the current policy so that you keep getting the $50 per meeting stipend until the new policy takes effect. So that language is written out there. It has been reviewed by our attorney, and they were okay with that language. So that's the gist of this item.
Thank you. We have a motion?
We have deliberation, so yeah, go ahead. Move to approve.
Second?
Second.
Discussion.
Do have a discussion item. I just would like to insert or append the text. Board members may choose to decline all or a portion of the stipend by informing the superintendent. And I suppose that needs to be inserted so it falls immediately after the new
Yep.
text
I
and
will.
before the old text.
I will insert it appropriately if the board supports that.
So now what do we have to have? We have to have a,
So now it's an amended motion, I suppose?
You say we do a friendly amendment to that
What are we gonna
effect,
do when
and
you're
then if
not
nobody
here?
objects,
We're gonna have to hire a parliamentarian.
a friendly amendment to that effect, and if no one objects, it's approved. But you have to say that, Louis.
If no, does anyone object?
I-
Does no one object?
I guess I'll just speak to that. In a way, I don't object to the person's right to do that, but on the other side of it, if everyone declines it except for one person, then it makes that person stick out. I feel like everyone should accept it, but then if you wish to donate it, feel free to do that.
The problem comes in with taxes,
Yeah.
because we have to report it, as income as soon as somebody accepts it. So then they owe taxes on that money.
But if you
even
donated
they-
it, isn't it tax deductible?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, they could
Well, I'm
donate
a-
it all away, but it still could end up actually costing them money rather than just declining it and not receiving it at all. I think that's
And that's been the case
the
with
issue,
my,
I think.
with what I've done with my stipend, is I've donated it to meals, but because I eat one of those meals, I don't claim it.
Well, I mean, but couldn't you just donate it to a charitable 501c3?
But you, like, if AMT, alternative minimum tax issues, that kind of thing, you can't
Yeah.
always deduct that stuff.
Right. I guess I feel like it's not like that dollar amount isn't very significant. If you're choosing to donate it, you're donating it because you don't need it. But I feel almost more like it's important not to make the person who might need it, who might not otherwise feel comfortable serving on the board, if they're not comfortable accepting the stipend,
I
that
agree.
it might sort of, I guess make it uncomfortable. Just like we might not have families want to sign up for free and reduced lunch because it gives them a stigma, or they feel that it's a
And
stigma.
we have a board norm, which is that you can decline it. And I think it's important to have this ability to just not take it. Because it's kind of silly to wind up having to pay, it just doesn't make any sense. You're actually having to lay out money in order not to take money.
Right.
But if we just had a board norm that we don't talk about it, so if you decline it, it's your business, and there's a letter that goes to you declining it,
That it's private.
but it's basically private. We're
Yeah,
not
I
gonna
would be
hire it.
comfortable with that. I just don't, I feel like the other, while it's honorable, it puts those who need it in a very uncomfortable situation.
I agree.
It's a great point.
Yeah. And I think the point of us doing this was so that we could lower the barrier of entry for someone who might feel that the lost time at work, cost of babysitters, other cost expenses that were in excess always of the $50 per meeting previously would have otherwise been a barrier. So I don't want to create a new barrier, whether it's real or perceived.
It's a great point. So you're okay with the language, and then we'll have the board norm that it's just done in private, and
Okay.
we don't make a big deal out of it.
Just on that point, board norms come, board norms go.
True.
Collective memories. So, because I think your point's a really strong one. And I think making this change, it's something that's been a struggle before, and the need to make sure that there's not a unintended barrier. So if it's not cumbersome, I mean, I'm okay with the board norm, but we really got to commit to it and find a way to keep it alive. Otherwise, maybe we find a way to actually put it in policy.
Do we have board norms in policy now?
Yeah, there's I can't remember if it's written as norms. Let me pull it up real quick.
It's kind of weird, but
Let's see. You'd think I'd have it memorized by now. I've looked at these so many times.
seems like it'd be
Maybe into the,
numbers 3.5.
yeah, maybe it's in like is it the Code of Ethics section? There's somewhere in there.
Code of ethics is D of all that on page 20.
Yeah, the word norm does not appear.
I thought we had our own
I thought it was
norms
a
document.
You know what it
separate
is, what I'm
document.
thinking of? We did, at one point, we were drafting board norms as a separate document, but I don't think that ever came to fruition. I do remember seeing
Great,
something
now we
like
have a
that.
new action item.
Yeah, that's right.
New work plan item.
I'll add it to your to-do list.
I completely agree with this. I want to move forward with this. I think the counterpoint I would offer is we don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable for taking it. We also don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable for not taking it. And I don't want us to only look at the one side and not the other, because I don't want to use any more time on it, but I think both deserve equal weight, and I don't think we need to shame or force either direction.
And I think, I mean, to your point, I think with Heather's example of if you would like to donate it or whatever you would like to do with it afterwards, is definitely up to you. I think just kind of making it known that this is what comes with this seat. And then what you do after that is, anybody's decision. But I think it does create an unintentional barrier that I think you suggesting is not your intention at all, but that's what it could present. And if we make this type of thing also kind of public, that you can accept it or you can't, and that kind of goes out, I would hate to also see maybe in a really tight campaign, somebody saying, well, if I'm going to choose not to, take it. So, because I don't need it and I want to make sure our kids get it or something of that nature. And I would hope that nobody would do that, but I don't want to set the precedent that is something that could even be, a subject. So just making sure, like Heather said, that we are just taking down as many barriers as we perceivably can. I mean, sometimes things comes up and we don't plan for it, but just the way it kind of sat with me when I saw the language, I just had a feeling about it. And so I just wanted to make sure that we addressed it and you kind of saw what we were thinking.
So what's our preference? Do we want to vote on the amended, without getting all formal, which one do we want to vote on?
We've got time until January rolls around, so I think, I'm okay with us moving forward with it. I don't think that this, the concern was that the word will almost sounds like a must. And I know that will in that sense is actually intended as in the future will.
I honestly think that it can be declined whether or not this is in the policy
I
anyway.
believe that's been the case that's
Right.
happened in the
Right.
past. But there has been that same pressure put in the past to force
Right.
a unilateral. And so I just want to make sure that we do not
Overweight.
put that pressure in either direction.
Agreed.
So if we were to retain as is and then follow up though on the board norm aspect of it, that might be the best way to
Yeah.
handle it.
Okay, so we now have a motion, or do we have a motion to approve the item that's in the agenda, not the amended item?
I think you first you have to let the
I
friendly
withdraw
fail.
the
Okay, there you go.
friendly amendment.
There we go.
We're gonna be
So the
lost without you,
original's
Garrett.
still on the table.
Original's still on.
With the
Do we
removal
have-
of the friendly.
And have we
I've
seconded it?
I've made a note for us to work on the norms document.
It was
so we don't
seconded.
forget.
And
Then-
seconded.
It was seconded.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye.
All right.
Okay, the next item is about board member benefits. You may recall, in the past, we made a change to policy so that the board members were eligible to participate in any of the benefits available to them that are available to employees. And let's see, 2.5 I2 says members may participate at their own cost in any of the personal liability, life, health, healthcare, accident, disability, salary protection, or other form of insurance made available to district staff if plan sponsors permit such participation. And this is here because it kind of goes along with compensation, because we had the discussion in the past about whether or not we would provide, and at that time we decided not, and that it would be at the cost of the members. But it does go along with the compensation discussion, obviously. I put the financial impact there. I did add a statement earlier today. David Adams pointed out to me that the state health benefit program actually sets different rates for board members than for employees. And so I did add that link into the board item, but so that for 2019, so there's a limit on how much can be contributed on behalf of the school district for the board member. So for instance, for a single plan, the maximum that the board can contribute is, depending on the plan, between $446 and $761. Is that per pay period or per month? Do you know? Per pay period or per month? Well, we know we have 2 pay periods every month, so some things get listed that way, but that sounds about right for per month, right? And the board member would have to pay between $83 and $250, depending on the plan. So I put the link there as an example. It's different for every plan, whether it includes children, spouse, or family, what those costs would be. But basically, the state law is that in general, the board cannot contribute more towards a board member's insurance than they contribute to a staff member's insurance, which I don't think will be too much of an issue for us, but that's something to be aware of. So I added that information there, and I also added in the information of what we contribute on behalf of employees.
Is there a motion?
There is no motion listed just because it depends on what the board wants to do, just to be clear. That's why there is no recommendation on this one.
I think I recall from when we were at the retreat, and I think Heather, you reminded me of this, that the conversation we were going to lead toward would just be for the stipend, and then table the health insurance or any changes that we might make to it for the future. And I think for me, what I would like for us to do, or to get into the habit of with the benefits and with the compensation, is that it's a conversation that the board has every year. So that it isn't something that ends up, we look down the line and it's been 10 years since things have been talked about, because things change. There's so many things that can change over the next few years. And so just getting in the habit of having the conversation and seeing if there are things that have changed, circumstances that have changed, that would make sense for us to go up, go down, go back, make another decision. And just with the 4 years that, I've been on the board, this is really the first time we've had a substantive conversation about it. And so, so my suggestion in adding this was for that reason. I think the other, what we experienced last year is when we were deciding on whether or not we could participate, we missed the boat for enrollment.
Right.
So that's the other reason why I think it's important that we are very intentional about at least having the conversation and making sure that, everything is heard and everyone is heard, and then we can just decide at that point what we're going to do from that. But I think it's definitely something we should have on our agenda every year at this time.
I'll make a note to make sure we get that on the annual calendar. That's a great point.
So this would fall under the changing board member compensation? Because it's stipend and benefits?
Well,
Or
and
not.
what we could do is just combine it as one item in the future, I think. I left it as 2 separate ones because we had 2 separate conversations about it. That's why you don't see them combined on here. But I think on the calendar, we can just have a compensation and benefits revisiting to kind of check in.
And to Tasha's point, to do that towards the end of the calendar year so that we're getting there right. If it is a compensation point, then we need to do it right before that rollover in the year.
I think
so
I would
that's
actually
fine.
do it in September in the future, probably. That way, most likely, they've set prices and things. We have some certainty about that. And so, because we don't want to go too early,
Right.
because we might not have all the information we want. But we don't want to go too late and miss open enrollment, for instance.
Exactly.
So
Right.
we'll double check on some of those timelines, but September, October usually is about right.
And it makes sense that it's tagged with compensation, but the compensation discussion can only be every other year.
Oh, every 2 years, that's true.
Oh, that's right.
Whereas
Yeah, no,
it sounds
that
to me
is
like the desire is to have this every year.
Well, and I'll double check. I wonder, I'm not sure if if the decision was to make contributions, it might also be every other year too. I will double check on that. That's a great point.
That would,
Based on how the terms align.
yep,
I'll
that would
check.
make sense.
It still would be useful to have the conversation, just so that you don't let it fall off.
Yeah.
the-
Even if no changes
right,
can be made,
right.
and, right.
Because I know you'd get, I mean, if the school district did contribute, you would get taxed as compensation.
Okay.
Even if you had no other stipend or anything, it would be money being paid on your behalf. So we will double check on the timing, if it is in every other year or not.
So I think I've said this before, I'll just say it again, since we're having the conversation. I, of course, have no objection to having the conversation every year or every other year, but I think it'd be a big mistake. I don't think it's, in my opinion, would be good or healthy to have board members with their health insurance tied to their service on the board. I just think that that's it could lead to people continuing their service when maybe their interest or it's just no longer the appropriate thing to do, but they're a little bit dug in because this is where their health insurance is. And so I think that the incentives there are I just don't think it's a good idea. I also don't think of this as a job. And I mean, it's not full-time, it's not half-time. We spend a lot of time, but in my opinion, it doesn't rise to that level. So that's my thought on it, which I just thought I'd offer.
I do like that we offer board members the ability to pay without the
Absolutely,
district.
which we do.
Because I think that could be a barrier that if it's an opportunity that we can do at board members' cost.
Right.
So,
Any further discussion?
move to table until superintendent schedules it on a board meeting agenda.
Right, I don't think we have to vote to table something. All right, this brings us to discussion items. We have the property tax.
All right, so the property tax study has finally arrived. I updated the agenda at 4:51 PM today to attach it there. So if folks want to see it, they can find it there. As you mentioned earlier in the meeting, Louis, I think, I know I haven't had much time to look at it. I know most of you haven't had any time to look at it. So I would recommend that we discuss it at the next meeting so that you have time to dig into it, because it is a pretty dense report, right? There's a lot of information there to absorb, so that would be my recommendation, unless you want to have a discussion about what you've been able to see so far.
Since I haven't read it, that works for me.
All right.
I'm excited to.
They were great to work with, GSU. I would go back to them in a heartbeat. They were very good. They really worked with us on, we saw an initial draft and gave, people see what kind of feedback we give. It's usually a lot, and it was. And they were very receptive to that and really listened to us. And while I haven't checked to make sure they addressed everything that we were concerned about, I'm pretty confident they probably did, because they were a great group to work with. So it was, I highly recommend them. It was very good.
When, I'm just trying to figure out when, given that we are tabling it, both for myself as well as just those interested, when do we think we're gonna pick this back up?
So I would assume at the November meeting, if that's our next regular meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, now we have a series of policy monitoring reports, beginning with policy 2.5, which I think is the security one.
Yes, so we're at the stage 2 for the safety and security report. Noel, if you want to come on up.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let's see. A nice little PowerPoint for you. Hang on a sec. Okay, no problem. Let me just kind of dive in so we don't sit with the pregnant pause for too long. Last meeting, I got some great feedback from you guys on what we will do to provide better monitoring reports, or more robust monitoring reports than what I presented the last time. And I think the central theme of that was not just give us the plan, it was give us the plan, what meetings, what things are you doing to work on the plan, what things are you doing to monitor that it's being implemented, and how to do that. So that's kind of the approach that I took to looking at new pieces of potential sources of evidence. So sans the presentation, I'm going to kind of start talking through them a little bit, and then it'll pop up on one of my slides that we'll scoot to. In terms of the district safety plans, I expanded that from the initial piece, which was just the check the box that you have submitted the plan. And part of that is going back and making sure, I think I'm on slide 3.
You
Oh,
can
I've got
click, yep.
I've got the control. Okay, so the school district safety plans, going beyond just the submission checkoff, looking at both the plan reviews from a local standpoint, so did they have the meeting to review it at the local level? And what did we do to review it here in this office? So that's part of that monitoring report piece. Then the actual review and approval of the school safety plans by the public safety agencies and what the follow-up is to that. So if they've got feedback for us of, hey, you missed this piece here, you need to add, code green flag regulation, whatever, we can go back and monitor that into those, or place those into those monitoring reports. The next piece would be the GMA threat assessment reports, and that's the report where GMA comes out and goes to each of our buildings and gives us a sort of a comprehensive look at, hey, these are things we see on the safety and security checklist, and that goes beyond just do your doors lock and things. That's also deals with day-to-day student safety. Do you have things stored properly in closets? I mean, it's a pretty extensive piece that they go through. With that, we want to provide documentation of our follow-up, so not just the report itself, but documentation that we've gone and addressed in some way each of those pieces, so you can see what we're doing to follow up with that safety piece. The next piece would go into the potential event reporting. This is something that I had to kind of really think through of how we can do this, because I think that there is a high interest from the board to know, hey, what kind of events are we having? What's our response to them, and how are we doing with those responses? And I think the best way to do that, Dr. Duty talked to this the last meeting a little bit. We always have sort of a debrief moment on big things, and it could be anything from we had an intruder in a building to we had a winter storm event, we had a hurricane event. All of those kind of events, we have some sort of debrief to those, and I think what we're going to do is formalize that a little bit more from the safety team aspect into a document that we can have, and through an executive session moment, share with the board, and that will get to that, because it's not just sort of, in my mind, it's not just sort of the chart of, hey, how many incidents did we have and what was our grade on it. It was more, I think it should be more of a, here's our debrief document, and here's what we saw, here are the things we experienced, here are some lessons learned, and here's how we felt like we reacted to it. I think that's a little more robust than just we had an incident and thumbs up. Although that's nice, that's not really where we should stop. And it also could give us some time in that executive session for some discussion. Drill reporting is a fairly straightforward piece. The drills that we do get reported to the insurance commissioner's website. That's available for anybody to see. We can post some links to that for parents and community members on the website itself under safety. And each year, the principal's yearly checkout, they have to have had all of those reports go into the insurance commission site. And those are not just fire evacuation drills, that includes tornado drills. And we ask that each of the schools have their lockdown drills reported as well. Not necessarily to there, but it will go into our final principal's checkout report. In addition to that, we've asked that principals begin making sure that we have folks there when they're doing their drills, when they're doing their lockdown drills, so that we can give them some feedback. And we want to formalize that feedback into some sort of, here's a document that we've given you just with some highlights of what we saw. The last part, I think, goes into the drill and safety training, which is beyond just the safety plan itself. We want to go into those faculty meeting sign-in sheets, the agendas, the things that the principals and assistant principals are doing at the local level with their teams, with their teachers, with their staff, to say, hey, here's our safety plan, here are our evacuation plans, things that we work on, and here's what we've done to train our staff. So not just the plan itself and not just the schedule, but the actual, hey, we've done this, and this will include the sign-in sheets and the agendas and things. So I think with a different look at this and a different lens to this, it gets a little closer to some of the reporting that you guys were asking for, and I'm hoping that we've taken a good swipe at it. So that'll take us to discussion and questions.
Any thoughts on that?
think it's good. I would say, can we go back
Sure,
to the
certainly.
slide? Sorry.
Yeah, not a problem.
On the potential event reporting to the board, I think this is one of those areas where if it is formalized a little bit more and there is some type of a accounting, qualifying, quantifying, how we execute in incidences. Right now, the board doesn't know about all the ways that we executed correctly.
Mhm.
We know about the couple big things that happen. If there's a lockdown at a school, we all hear about it. And so I think this is an opportunity to show, in many cases, how well we're executing. It also would allow us to set a baseline. And, you know, if there are certain things that are happening all the time or at particular schools, it might be one of those things we could have a conversation about, where there are opportunities, you know, to make improvements. I'm a little bit, one thing that just popped out at me is that the sign-in sheets and the training sheets may be good sources of evidence for the staff in the central office, but from a policy governance perspective, that is more process-oriented than
Sure.
results-oriented, and so that might be something we might want to revisit
Okay.
at some time, is how do we, you know, we don't want to get into your process. We want to measure the results of the process.
I had this, I'll just jump in, because I had the same thought, which is that generally this seems very much on point in what we're looking for.
Sure.
In terms of the form of the reporting, we've seen there have been similar things like this where those kind of bullets, the end result, which is presented to us, is like a portfolio with a bunch of
Yeah.
receipts attached, which is almost useless to us, right?
Right.
And instead, what I have in mind is more like an audit. And basically, you have a plan. The plan includes specific deliverables. It includes a cycle of activities that you're going to do, have meetings at these times, staff are going to be trained at such and such a level on this schedule. This stuff is built into a plan that have checks boxes, and at the audit stage, which is the monitoring report, you basically self-report and
Yeah.
go through and say, here's the plan, here's what I was supposed to do, and I'm telling you, this is what I did or didn't do, and if I didn't do it, here's how I'm gonna rectify that, or whatever. And instead of, so what we want is the conclusions.
Yeah.
Not actually the evidence. The only piece of that is that there's, you know, in an audit, you have an independent audit, and so there's a little bit of accountability built in. And I think that it would be nice for us to think of a way to build some of that into this process, just so that you've got more than one eye, more than the, you know, the person responsible for
Yeah.
doing the implementation. It'd be nice if it were not entirely a self-report, but that you've got
Yeah.
cross-fertilization of team members looking at it. or something like that.
We could certainly build that into the principals checkout process that we have through operations, and that would give us a little bit of oversight as well as some self-reporting.
I had one additional thought, which,
Sure.
since I was talking, I'll just go ahead and add it, which is that in your checklist, and I think that there could also be elements relating to maintenance. And so, for instance, and we've discussed this, and I know that you've been dealing with it, but, you know, if there's a lock on a door that's not working, that needs to be fixed, and it needs to be a high priority. And so one of the pieces of evidence that we ought to be tracking, I think, is we've already got a system to track maintenance requests. Certain maintenance requests should get coded as being security related. And we should be making sure that these locks are fixed right after they're broken. Or you've got, you know, whatever the issue is, but, you know, gates, you know what I'm
Sure.
talking about.
When some of those cases, people are reporting those things to the wrong, you know, spot, and so the lock doesn't get fixed because it doesn't get into the
Right.
system.
So we should have some kind of a way to make sure that these things do get into the
Yeah.
right system and tracked accordingly.
Yeah, I think Lewis articulated what I was thinking really well. I feel like the most important thing that you're doing here is taking what's in a document and making it living, breathing, actionable, and also accountable.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking very much at the accountability and the reporting mechanisms here, and how are, you know, those in charge, and, you know, the board and Dr. Duty and your cohorts at the various schools, informed and given feedback as to, this is what we said we were gonna do and this is what we did. And I think it'd be interesting to see if you are able to work into this, some explanation or description of the frequency of how often you think things should happen for these different items. You know, training might be at the beginning of each annual school year. The drills might, you know, you don't want them all necessarily crammed at the end of the year, because some of them you want to have at the beginning of the year so kids know what to do. And just some timing and some time frame around the action items that you're calling for and when you think reporting would be appropriate
Sure.
for those things.
And I think those things are defined both within the safety plan and
Okay.
with the insurance commissioner's requirements and some other things. So we'll figure out a way to articulate that a little bit better in this monitoring report so
Okay.
that translates out from stuff that we can't share in the board meetings, so that it's not the guessing game of, well, how many did you do? You're saying you're doing, but how many did you do? And again, you don't want to cram them all into one place, and we
Right.
don't. So
Right.
I'll put that into the report for
Okay.
the frequency piece. That makes a lot of sense.
Thanks.
Anything else?
Any other thoughts?
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, all.
Appreciate the
Thank you
feedback.
I think the next one is.
The next one is 2.8, which is all about finance. So Susan is going to come join us. This is the stage 1 report for the finance policies.
Good evening, members of the board, Dr. Duty. I don't know why, but I'm really nervous about this. I asked Eston if he would just pull up basically the attachment. I did not do a fancy document for y'all. So basically, I just was going to run through and read through my interpretation of 2.8, and then actually just look at the potential sources of evidence to get you guys feel for what your thoughts are with my interpretations that I've had. So basically, the superintendent, with the support of staff, shall develop in an open and transparent manner an annual budget that is reasonably conservative, aligns with the ends policies of the district, and adheres to local, state, and federal guidelines. After the budget has been adopted, the board will be presented with monthly financial statements by fund, capital, general, and special revenue that summarizes the revenue and expenditure trends. If there are any material deviations to the budget and/or any changes or conditions that can materially affect the district's financial condition, the board will be made aware of such events in a timely manner. In addition to budget development and review, Policy 2.8 addresses the acceptance of outside donations, investments, and vendor relationships. Each of these areas, if not properly reviewed and documented, could have adverse effects to the annual budget. So what I did was I actually went through, Eston, if you can move down just a little bit for me, because I'm assuming.
Do you want to get to the potential sources of evidence table?
Yeah, there it is. Okay. So what I did was I actually went through and I looked at each of the items and basically how they fell under like A, B, C, D, and E. And then from there, if there were things that I felt like I combined them and came up with an interpretation and a potential source of evidence. So you'll see for the first one, it says to recommend annual budgets that are aligned with the ends policies. My interpretation was that the budgets will be developed to provide an equitable allocation of resources based on my interpretation of the ends policies. I felt like that a potential source of evidence would be the school staffing and budgeting allotment model.
I don't think you need to read through all of those.
Okay, cool, then I won't. So basically, at the end of the day, that's what I did, was I took each one of these items, then I took my interpretation of what I felt like each of those items could be, and then found something that I felt like we could report out on to make sure that those were the things that we were actually doing. So I would love to hear any thoughts that you may have, because like I said, this was my interpretation, so I'm open for anything.
Garen, I know you shared some thoughts. Feel free to repeat them if you want, but I have shared those with Susan as well.
Okay, the first one, and I just want to start by saying there's more policy language related to finance than anything else in the board policy manual. So there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot that goes into this report, and I thank you for the work that you're doing on this. A lot of our board meetings revolve around finance and the schedule of the year. The one I'd bring up would be to recommend annual budgets that are aligned with INS policies. And here I'm balancing the monitoring reports aspect of this with the, there's got to be some board-related something in the work plan. And I think we talked about it this year about having some meeting shortly before the budget meeting so that we talked about how the priorities of the board feed into and are reflected in the budget planning process. And I think what I'm looking for here is something that captures the tail end of that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But that's where I'm going, is something that captures that kind of conversation the board has had about the priorities that, in a way that ends up in the report and that draws the connection between that model and how it, and really what that comes down to is, every couple of years we'll have a bump, and the bump is we can't do everything. There are limited resources. If you want more of this, we got to give up some of that. And so I think the advantage of having that conversation at the front end is that when the board gets to the budget and we've had the conversation and the budget reflects that conversation, it's kind of a no surprises. We're all on the same page. We know that we have to give up some things if we're going to focus on other things.
Okay.
I'm going to reiterate what you said just so that I can make sure I understand this. So basically what you're saying is that make sure as a potential source of evidence to include that the priorities of the board, that we have discussions before we actually jump into the budget development process, so we can ensure that these priorities are included in the budget development process. Is that it in a nutshell?
David might have a slightly different spin on that.
I've got notes. We'll go through it.
Okay, good.
And the second point is very brief, and it's the next one, which is maintain an unassigned fund balance of 4 to 15% based upon annual budgeted expenditures. The interpretation is 2 months. My math is that 2 months is 15%. So, but I also understand that you really do want to have 2 months.
So basically, I saw your comment, and my response back would be that what I did was I took 2, the protect the district's long-term fiscal health, as well as 8, maintain the unassigned fund balance between 4 and 15%, and kind of came up with both of those. So what your thoughts are right on. It really is somewhere closer to 15% than it is the 4%. But my thinking was, in looking at the long-term fiscal health, it would be, and basically DOE recommends that you have at least 2 months of reserves. If nothing else, they kind of do that because we have to accrue the months of July and August. So that's kind of where their thought process is, so that we can have enough money set aside should, God forbid, anything happen, that we could pay those July and August salaries. That's it in a nutshell, and that's kind of what my thinking was behind that.
Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, or are you concerned?
It does. It's just that the interpretation jumps to something different than the policy wording.
Right.
And I understand the kind of the rock in the hard place.
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but one of those, either 4 or 15%, is in Georgia code.
It's the 15. You can't have any more than 15%.
Yeah. So maybe we should update our interpretation to reflect that, because if the 2 months is over 15%, even by Georgia code, we wouldn't be allowed to do that.
No.
Right.
So we'll work on that interpretation to more accurately reflect that. Other thoughts?
I have a question.
Sure.
And I'm curious if you think, or if other board members think that this would maybe be a good place to have some sort of a summary or a diagram of the budget cycle on a yearly basis, showing just the major milestones that we go through, so that we could place in this monitoring report in an appropriate place, the pre-budget conversation in an appropriate place. We've talked about having the actual budget approval sooner because of it impacting the hiring that we do, which we have also emphasized doing sooner. And so I've been through this a couple times now, and I kind of know when it happens, but I think it still would be helpful to see it, so that we can, if we have more pieces that we put in this that we can place them appropriately, make sure that we're
Sure.
syncing.
Sure,
things.
yeah. I said that I added that basically the budget calendar is presented with each presentation, but what you're saying is go ahead and add a copy of that in there with it.
I think so.
Yeah.
It would be helpful.
Okay.
And then as we have these conversations, we can talk about more appropriately when it would make sense to have them.
Sure,
Okay, thank you.
of course.
Any other thoughts on that one?
So I'll share my thought, which is that I would, to the extent I have here to pull out, it'd be gone if I had to go through this process of trying to figure out how to, I don't feel like this policy fits very neatly in this template. And I think it'd be a very frustrating exercise to be tasked to try to cram it in there. So I feel for you. And I don't think it always,
What was frustrating is that she had to write a report based on words, not numbers, right?
I'm telling, no, you don't understand. I'm like, first of all, I'm like
That's why she's
nervous.
stressed right
I'm stressed. I'm really nervous. And I'm like, I've never done this. And I said, David, I need to meet with you about this because I don't know what I'm doing. And it's like teaching an old dog new
I
tricks.
think
So-
of all the ones, this would be one of the hardest to figure out how to fit into this framework. It just doesn't, it's not a natural fit. And so some of the things that seem a little discordant to me are, for instance, if the policy is to recommend annual budgets that are aligned with our ends policies, and then the interpretation takes out one piece of our ends policies, which is that we have an equitable allocation of resources. But of course, the ends policies are the ends policies. That's one of them. There's a whole lot more. And so that interpretation is really too narrow. But then you've got potential sources of evidence that go actually way beyond an equitable allocation and really do kind of address, because the school staffing and budgeting allotment model is in fact the process and the mechanism that gives us confidence that funds are being allocated appropriately. So I like where you land. The process that we forced you to cram it into seems unnatural and not very satisfying.
No, we can,
And I've
I
wondered.
agree it's too narrow based on that, and we can
Well, it could be that like,
clarify that.
in some cases, it's a problem of quantitative versus narrative discussion. And this is one that, to my mind, cries out for a more narrative kind of a discussion that here's how we interpret this. We interpret this, and it could be very process-oriented. And so we're going to ensure that the budget is recommended and aligned with ends policies. Here's how we're going to do it, which is that we're going to advance the budget discussion to this point in the year. We're going to give a check-in with the board to make sure that we've kind of hit the main priorities. We've got this school staffing and budgeting allotment model with this heavy involvement from the building leaders to ensure that specifics are addressed at each school. And I mean, that is in fact what we're doing. And instead of trying to cram it into kind of a checklist model, maybe we should just sort of say that.
No,
And
that's
then-
that's exactly what we should be putting there. It's a great point.
And then the monitoring is to verify that, because again, the schedule should say, here's the process, here's the sequence, here's when these things are gonna happen. And then the monitoring is, yeah, we followed that process
Right,
this time.
right.
It worked. Or we didn't, and this is why, and this is how it'll be adjusted next time. Others of these are a little bit odd, and it's just a checklist that we borrowed from some other, how to make a school policy manual. And it's kind of like general principles of accounting or whatever, long-term health and that kind of thing. For which, in most cases, the evidence and really we're going to be satisfied with the annual, we're going to rely on our external auditor, and it's really going to be it. And then and so for those, it seems like we should sort of cluster those together and say that, this is a standard thing that's covered in the audit. In some cases, we've made choices as a board about how we want things. We've had lots and lots of discussion about what conservative.
Right.
So in those cases, again, it's probably narrative, but it's just that basically what through our interactions with the board and the superintendent and staff at our meetings, we've decided that reasonable but conservative projections means this, and this is how we're going to be doing it.
Yep.
Just set it out.
No problem.
But I don't know. So maybe that's my general reaction to these things, and maybe a little bit of thought about the framework, that there might be a different way to present it It's the
No,
content's
actually, I
fine.
appreciate the feedback. They're great points, and I can see how we can incorporate that in with this, actually. We can work on that.
Good, because I'll be honest with you, I'm lost.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Cool. What else?
Picking up a little bit on the point raised at the beginning around the, whatever discussion's been had to date manifests itself in what the budget actually is portraying. You've got a point in here, it's the one, multiple drafts of the budget are presented to the board using various projection models, which, when I read that, I thought that is, I think that's a great interpretation. But then when I read the, and so maybe this gets to the format just not being right, but the potential sources of evidence was more of a, it was more sequential as opposed to modeling different options. So I wasn't clear on whether or not I was misinterpreting the piece around that you'll using various projection models, or whether or not you're so I guess I'm trying to get at is are you intending to provide different scenarios?
Yes, we did this year.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So what we did was we actually went through and provided different scenarios based on conservative, moderate.
Oh, I see what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so basically, yes, we did. We went through and actually provided more than just the usual way.
Okay.
We provided different ways. So what I was trying to do was actually say, okay, this is what we're doing, and then what is the evidence? The evidence is basically in the budget presentations. As we present those, we're going to present those different scenarios with each presentation. And then I think there were several different times that we came back and even made changes. And one of them we even called Garrett's budget, I think.
we did.
Yeah, the GG, but yeah. So we came by. We actually put together all sorts of different scenarios for the first time. I think we may have done it last year, but I'm really more for this year.
Well, it's not clear to me whether we wanted to go through that process again.
Well, but I think the point, and to your point, Mark, I think what we can do is upgrade this interpretation to explain that when we say various projection models,
Yes.
what we're meaning is
Right.
that we're going to provide kind of some parameters to make sure the board is aware of risk, really, is what it comes down to, of if tax revenues come in this range and expenses in this range, where is the variability that we're gonna end up on? Because every budget is developed using guesses, right? You rarely have certainty in what's gonna happen, and that was the point of the projection models, was to look at those ranges of possibilities, so we knew just how risky we were being. So we can reword that to capture that better, because I think that's a good point, because that's really what it is.
Yep.
It's about that
Did that-
capture of risk, so.
Did that answer your question?
Good.
Okay.
Yep, thanks.
But to your point, we don't have to go through that same process. Like, we now have parameters.
We wound up with a pretty good thing.
Exactly.
Which is a projection that does show the risk.
Correct.
But it was kind of like one option of like 6 different ways to
There-
present it.
yep.
We
Correct.
don't need to go through.
So a
all
lot of it, we
6.
do not have to go through again. It'll be more here is the potential range of tax revenues. Here's the potential range for expenses, whatever, something like that.
And then having more of a focus on the fund balance staying the same, because the variables were showing, if the millage rate is this, and then
Right.
it was the fund balance, and then it was the expenditures. So instead, this was the GG method.
Yes.
If we base it on just keeping the fund balance the
Yeah,
same,
hold
then
that
what does
constant.
it do to everything else?
Exactly.
And it just made much more sense, once we.
Let the millage rate be the variable, not
variable.
the fund balance.
Exactly,
And
yeah, so.
it's a great point.
Good.
To Heather's point about the annual roadmap, and I think to one of Lewis's points when we talked about monitoring reports in the past, it's kind of, the narrative provides that one place rationale for what's going on. The roadmap is the annual cycle. There's also, primarily, this is the one-stop shop for that whole annual cycle with the financial monitoring report. Secondarily, It also serves as an interface for the public to, an entry point, you know, touch the school, touch a truck, touch the school finances. So I don't want that to, I wouldn't want us to start there this year, but I could see this evolving over the years to make it easier as an entry point for community members to have an overview and an understanding of how school finances work in the city of Decatur. But again, I don't want to put that out there for, you know, year one, maybe not even year two, but just evolving in that direction to make it more public friendly while it's primarily serving the purpose of the financial monitoring report.
And I hope all of our monitoring reports end up serving that purpose once we get them to a point that they're mature enough. Absolutely. Okay, anything else on 2.8?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Susan. The next one is 4.1 and 4.2, which is the first time we've done one from section 4, and I have to tell you, it was not easy. So this is the 4.1 is authority and duty of the superintendent, and you may recall 4.1D is like the catch-all. It basically says the superintendent operates the school district. That's a little hard to do some interpretations for some of these. And then 4.2 is the one about succession planning. So what I did to at least start the conversation is for each of those things that are areas that are notated in the policy, I put the associated, like, if I need to provide for the operation of school buses, I have an AR on school buses. If I have to provide for the impact of infectious diseases, I have an AR in infectious diseases. So you'll see it's very AR specific, which again is very much like focused on the product, not the outcome. So if you want me to take a different track somehow, I'm happy to do that. So just consider this as a starting point to the discussion. But yeah, so that's the gist of it. But this was I wasn't surprised when I went to do this one that it was a little more complicated than I expected.
I have some thoughts that are similar to the discussion with the security, which is that I really don't want in a monitoring report copies of board packets, minutes, agendas, and that kind of thing. I'd be more interested in, I mean, some of these things are just kind of silly. I mean, you do serve as a secretary and frankly don't even need a monitoring. You know what I mean? I think that we can just sort of pass over some of these things. And I'd be satisfied just with a checkbox that says, yep. And some of them, I mean, board packets, it is in fact important to get that out. And if we have a policy that says for the Friday before or whatever, but even still, maybe then you provide us a statistic which says that, you know, I got it out by Friday, these are the number of times that I missed it. You can just give kind of a summary piece of data instead of, you know, like, I don't want to see photos of setups, right? And really, I also don't think that personally, I don't think that needs to be, I mean, if we have an issue, we'll raise it, but a lot of this would be make work. It just, there's no point in. School bus operation and safety. Well, here's one where I don't yet know, perhaps the regulation's already drafted, I don't know. Probably has been.
This is one I think that's in a process right now. This was one that got added when the attorneys reviewed our policy manual. Several of these are those that the attorneys said, oh, you need to have a policy on X, Y, Z.
Well, here's one where we, you know, there are issues that we need to be monitoring, tracking. Some things need to be fixed, and you know, for that one, I think it's important that it's not simply, yes, we have the administrative regulation. I think that we should actually have a look to say, you know, yes, the training was provided, yes, the kids are making it home, and, you know, whatever the policies are, I mean, there can be some metrics, and I think reporting on those actual metrics would be appropriate.
Okay.
And actually, I think that'd be, for all of these, I think, you know, internet safety likewise. I don't know what those things would be, but maybe what it is that they're identified in the AR. The monitoring report lifts out what you've said you're going to do. Lets us know if you did it.
Okay.
And provides some summary statistics.
Makes sense. Yep.
I agree with that.
No problem.
I think that would, I had the similar thought about some metrics around some of those things. think that would
We can flush
satisfy
that out in the next version.
Definitely want to make sure it's less work, seem
to be Right.
putting
more Yeah.
work on your plate.
I could see this as kind of a bully pulpit for you to showcase, you know, the continuous improvement cycle of the things that you set out to do and have done in the given year. And maybe it's tied closely to the, you know, the policy and the administrative regulations in those areas, but I would give you a lot of latitude to demonstrate in the report the leadership through the year.
Okay. Awesome.
On to 4.2.
4.2 is succession plan. This one was really complicated just because it is one of those things that you don't need it till you need it. And so I felt like the evidence was that there is a plan. And that one I really struggled with coming up with. Like the other ones you were just talking about, I think we can definitely come up with metrics. This one is difficult for me to figure out what the metric would be.
Do you have a plan? I think it's
Yeah,
yes or no.
I think this is, do you have a plan,
I agree.
basically, so.
I agree.
And
Okay.
is there any, and there really isn't anything to monitor at that point,
Not
right?
really, other than there are times we use it, right?
Just that the
Like,
plan's up to date.
we
And,
use-
like,
I
maybe
mean-
the monitoring
Up
is
to
that the plan's
yeah,
been updated.
is it up to date and
Yeah.
being used? I mean, there are times that it comes up, like if a principal leaves, we use the succession plan to figure out who takes over, that kind of stuff.
Kind of stuff, okay.
So, there may be in a given year some evidence of it being applied.
Yeah, I could see this one being here's where the succession plan came into play in the last year. Here's where it worked well, here's where we could improve it. So that could be focused more on the outcomes of how did the plan work in action.
Yeah, gotcha.
And it might be that, you know, there isn't very much some years.
Yep. Okay. And the best part about that one is if it's needed for me, I won't be the one reporting on it, so that'll be awesome.
You could just not show up to that meeting. See what happens.
For future dates, I have a couple notes. I can't remember if we got them in here or not. My thing's not coming up anyway. I'll just say them anyway. Just a reminder that delegation, the DeKalb delegation town hall is October 15th from 6:30 to 8. You may remember I sent out a thing about that. I think it's important that we have somebody there. So I would recommend that maybe we talk about that a little bit, about who can go. And
Where, what time?
does anyone remember where? I don't have it.
Is that the Maloof building?
At the Maloof building, that's right, yes.
Oh,
Thank you.
what time?
6:30 to 8.
I have it on my calendar, so I'll.
You're able to attend? Okay, so Tasha can attend. Anyone else?
I'll attend too.
You can? Okay.
That's a
Perfect.
Friday.
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
October 15th.
Well, I'm looking at the totally wrong. I looked at the 18th.
It's like me when I get totally off on dates.
I'm sorry, tell me the time one more time.
October 15th at 6:30 to 8.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, so the 6.
Chair and
6:30 to
vice
8
chair,
on
we're-
October
We're
15th.
good.
Chair and vice chair,
Are you on the right? Yeah, you're on the right day. Good.
you're right over there, Lucas?
Hey, can, Ashaki, can you add that to the board calendar? Even if- And more could attend if they wanted, right? There's no
They
reason.
could,
It would
yes.
not be a meeting.
Correct. You could attend as long as you're not discussing district business.
So we've committed to attend, so no one has to feel that they need to go because the meeting's covered, but everybody would be welcome.
Yeah.
Right?
And then you may remember the doodle poll for a joint work session with the city. October 24th was the date that worked best. Because it was a while ago, Andrea is double checking with commissioners, but I think we should tentatively plan on October 24th from 7 to 9 for a joint work session.
So let's get that one on the
24th.
calendar too.
You're on the 23rd.
Yeah, no, I was looking to see it.
So we're having a work session 2 days before that, right? Or is, okay.
Yeah.
And then okay, just making sure I'm not confusing.
One
the
is
two.
our work session and then the other is the joint one. And
Tell
the
me the time again, I'm sorry.
7 PM to 9 PM is what we typically do.
What's our topic?
So
for
the
work
topics we had discussed at 1.1 was just a general discussion of like annexation policy, like we've talked about with them before, and especially with what happened with the SB 53 and some things like that, and kind of talking through that with
Oh,
them.
you're talking about with the city?
With the city
Oh,
for the
okay.
joint work session.
Got
I think the other work session
The other work session is, the second part of ends policies, like character and things like that.
Can we move that? I'm just gonna suggest that we don't have 2 work sessions in one
Same
week.
week.
I
Yeah.
support that if we.
I think, I mean, I would just cancel our October 22nd and just
Okay.
shift everything one
1 month,
month.
so move
Yeah.
that to November.
Is the, just thinking about the topics of the discussion with the city, given that this has just come out,
That's the second topic, exactly,
Okay.
that we had talked about potentially having the senior homestead exemption discussion.
yeah, so I'm wondering if,
Oh, it's before the next meeting.
would it make sense for us to have maybe had a work session around this? This is the exact opposite of what you were saying, I'm sorry. But, is it important for us to have had a work session around this before we then talk to the city about this?
Could we have that work session at 6 or 5:30 the same day? So that we at least have a chance to get on the same page before we're
We could.
That's a good idea.
in a big group.
That way we don't have to do the whole week.
We can do that.
So instead of 7, 6, give ourselves an hour,
Is that enough?
is that
Should we
enough?
say 5:30 to
5:30?
not?
5:30 might be better.
5:30.
Okay.
On the, which day?
So on October
On the
24th
Thursday.
at 5:30, we'll do a just you work session to talk about homestead exemption. And then at 7, we'll do a joint work session with the city, and the topics I'll recommend with Andrea are basically annexation policy and senior homestead exemption discussion. And then, obviously, they have to agree to that too, so I'll work with her and they may have a topic they want to discuss too. I'm not positive, but.
If there's any, it might be trying to shoehorn too much in, but that, the spreadsheet and the work that you all have done on the development report, if there's any chance to keep putting that type of thing into those, inserting it into the conversation so that we're
That
dealing
would
with
be an
some,
appropriate time to do it. We'll do our best to
And
try
that
to
re-
advance that a little
some
faster.
commonly agreed
It
upon.
relates to annexation. We've used that when there's been
Yeah, this would be a perfect
naturally
time. In
linked,
fact, it was this exact
It was the
event
last time,
that
Right.
we kind of debuted it. so.
Okay, I like that. Thanks, Garrett.
Okay, so we will cancel the 26th, work
22nd?
session. 22nd, thank you. 22nd work session, and we'll do 2 work sessions on the 24th. We'll get that all updated. If anything changes with that, once I hear back from Andrea, I'll let you know, but assume that that's what's gonna
Yeah,
happen.
and maybe, I mean, even if the city couldn't meet, maybe we would keep our date on the 24th so
Right.
that we at least get on,
Mhm.
have an
Agreed.
opportunity to discuss, and then we'll follow their lead if that date has to change for a future meeting.
Yes.
Unless it's really close, then we could keep them together, but.
Perfect. That's all I had for some future date things.
So I'll mention this, this is a meeting for the three of us, but I say the three of us, for Tasha and David. You know, we've reached out to DeKalb to try to continue our talk about the annexation policies as we committed to do. And we do have a response from the DeKalb board proposing that we meet on the 16th of October.
I will not be in town.
So
It's not gonna
Wednesday.
It's fine. I mean, I don't need to be part of the meeting, but I think it's best to not have superintendents involved, but if you want me involved, we'll have to do it on a different day.
Would that work for you, Tasha?
16th works for me, yes.
All right, so I'll respond and we'll figure out that, but I did want y'all to know that
Awesome.
this is moving. The only other comment I have is that, after we've got our retreat focused on competency-based education in Colorado. I keep promising to bring these books. They're in my car, and so I have a collection of books. If somebody would like to read up on, I can't remember which one, I haven't read any of them. I bought them, and they're the
You highly recommend them now?
I can't tell you which ones are good, which ones, one of them's like a handbook, it's way too like,
Skip that one.
You know, most people build one of those cute little libraries for
I
their
know.
front yard, with the little
Linden
door in
Library.
it.
So-
You just throw them in your trunk.
I thought I'd pick one, and if anybody's interested in some reading material.
Well, I will
Send me in the
say,
parking lot.
I will probably end up taking one of those. I don't think everybody was in the room, but I will not be able to attend the event because I had to spend a week and a half in California. So I can maybe read up on one of your books, and then that way I can feel like I'm more part of the discussion when you all get back.
You could write us a book report so we'd all know what it said.
I think that's it. Do we have anything else?
No, we have to finish executive session that we had to postpone from earlier. It should be pretty quick. I don't anticipate any
personnel?
votes. We have personnel and property are the two topics, but I don't anticipate any votes.
Move to enter executive session after a 5-minute recess to discuss personnel and property matters.
see what you did there, Garrett. I like it.
All in favor, or do we have a motion? Second motion, do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, so we're now executive session.
Gotta get my guy here, guys.